Joining us today on this beautiful day. I'm very conscious that you're all looking at Merrion Square and you'd probably much rather be out there, so we'll keep things brief today. So do keep in mind all the questions that you'd like to ask. I will hand over to you at the earliest opportunity. So my name is Sarah Carey. I'm a columnist with the Irish Independent. We have an incredibly wide and deep panel here today with all kinds of experience around all the different ways that media works in Ireland, North and South. Sarah Creighton is a contributor to The Guardian, The Fabian, The Belfast Telegraph and the Slugger O'Toole website and many broadcasting organisations. Eamonn Quinn is a Dublin-based Ireland economics writer for the Irish News, and he's a fantastic CV. He's worked on business and economics publications for the Irish Examiner, the Sunday Tribune, and also the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg and the FT. So I think that will give us a really good external view of what they're interested in Ireland. Amanda Ferguson is the Northern Ireland correspondent for Reuters, and she also contributes to the Washington Post and to broadcast media. And then Eoin Brannigan is the editor-in-chief of the Belfast Telegraph and Sunday Live. He's a former editor of the Irish Daily Star. He was there for 23 years working as its sports editor and deputy editors. I think it's really interesting that a Dub is appointed editor of the Belfast Telegraph. We might get into that. So I'm going to ask each one of them just to give me a minute on their perspective on the topic and what their particular experience lends to it this morning. Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yes, hello. My name's Sarah. I'm from Belfast. I'm a solicitor by profession. I'm a solicitor for one of the largest housing charities in Northern Ireland. So that's my bread and butter job. But in my spare time, I do freelance writing and commentary, which I very much enjoy. I'm basically a rent-a-gob. So I'm a unionist. I'm also from a Protestant background. Would describe myself as a very disgruntled unionist at the moment, to be quite frankly honest with you. But that's where I'm at. So unlike these guys, I wouldn't be within the industry. You know, I write my columns, I have my little bit on the radio, and I consume a lot of media, so I suppose I'll maybe be coming from that perspective as well. Mm-hmm.
And you're a solicitor in the day job.
Yeah.
Owen, so how does a Dub end up editor of the Belfast Telegraph, and how's that working out for you?
Can we go on a nature walk instead? Yeah, it's a long story. As you said, I suppose fell into journalism and sports journalism, and I was in the Irish Daily Star for 23 years. I suppose moved up the ranks and was editor there. And then 5 years ago, but just over 5 years ago, so it was, as I was saying to Eamonn earlier, it was in the middle of lockdown number one. The job at the Belfast Telegraph came up, and for various reasons, it made sense for me. I've always had, I suppose I'm of that generation where I grew up exposed to the Troubles. Mm-hmm. Northern Ireland was always on TV, radio. I always had an interest. I wouldn't say I was an expert or anything close to it, but I did have an interest. I think one of the reasons why you make a change in career at some stage is family related. I suppose a lot of people, they'd look at me and say, "What, you going to Belfast Telegraph? What the hell? Why are you going up there
up
for?"
There,
up there.
Yeah.
I mean, but I married into a family from Belfast. My wife actually moved down to Dublin with her family back in the mid-70s. So she was born in Belfast. So it wasn't that she was dictating it, but it was an easier sell.
Yes.
You know, I didn't come home and I wasn't ashamed of saying I was going to take a job in Belfast.
Very good. Eamonn, what about yourself?
Yeah. Well, my first real job, first career was in England. It was, I'm from Belfast, so I was starting from early 1980s Belfast. I found myself working as a researcher in a management college in Henley-on-Thames. quite a dramatic change. Not quite Buckfast to Pims, but maybe something similar. Then I got into journalism in London, working for US financial newswires, covering Whitehall releases. Then from Dublin, back home in Dublin, I was from 1995, again with Dow Jones, working with Dow Jones and then Bloomberg. And it was a period of, I would term as Huganordy. It was coming up to the Good Friday Agreement, either side of that. And the wake-up call for me was the coverage of the Mary McAleese by the media, by the Dublin media, by certain sections of Dublin media, of that presidential campaign. For a Belfast man, it was who'd worked, obviously who had been brought up during the Troubles. It was a bit of a wake-up call that there was a problem with Dublin media.
Yeah.
And in their attitudes to the North. Then I've worked for basically for either side of the financial crisis, again with New York Times reporting out of Belfast and Dublin, and the Wall Street Journal, and it was also with the as you said, the Sunday Tribune, RIP. It was a very, very good newspaper, and then and more later into last year for last 10 years as business editor of I was also with Sunday Business Post as business editor, and then Sunday and business editor of the Irish Examiner.
So you've seen it from all sides. Amanda, tell us about yourself.
My name's Amanda Ferguson, and I'm born and bred in North Belfast. I'm from a cross-community family, which means one parent, one Catholic, one Protestant. Whenever I had to describe that to my Washington Post editor, he couldn't believe that was what constituted a cross-community marriage, but there you go. So I've been a journalist for 15 years. I've always been freelance by choice. I like variety, and I think probably at this stage I'm so opinionated I'm unemployable. So for the last nearly 10 years, I've been Reuters News Agency's Northern Ireland correspondent, and I also work as the Ireland stringer, both jurisdictions, for the Washington Post. I do similar roles for LBC in Britain, and I would be regular on RTE and News Talk and Today FM, but also all the stations in Britain. So depending who I'm working for, depends how I get introduced. You know, I was the Northern correspondent for the Irish Times for 5.5 years, and you know, if I'm covering a story that's of all island interest for a British outlet, I suddenly become their Ireland correspondent rather than their Northern Ireland correspondent. So I think that I've always been an active member of the National Union of Journalists. I'm currently on the National Executive Committee in the Northern Ireland seat. Being part of the union is very important to me because I believe in collective solidarity and workers' rights. And about 5 years ago, we set up an organisation, me and some colleagues, called Women in Media Belfast, which is about amplifying women's voices, showcasing expertise. And part of the reason for that is because there are different similar organisations in the rest of Ireland and in Britain, and sometimes people forget to invite the Northerners or the people from Northern Ireland. So we were like, well, we'll do our own. So that was kind of how we came to that. And just with regards to where I come from, I would identify as an Irish woman, and that's my identity. But I'm able to cover every story because I'm a professional person, and I had a great joy about 10 years ago when my mother, who's from Larne in East Antrim, telling me about her people being from West Cork, and then my really sort of confidence and high opinion of myself suddenly made sense. So in a new Ireland, I will be leaning into my Cork roots.
Very good.
That's quite good.
So look, you can see we've great perspective here, and what we want to talk about, what media, be it news, sport, business and culture, is shared north and south. What is not shared north and south. And we want to talk about the mechanics of how the industry works in both jurisdictions in terms of audiences, employment, the depth and breadth of coverage, and to what extent it matters and why. And I'm going to start therefore with Eoin, because we work for sister papers. I'm with the Irish Independent, he's Belfast Telegraph. They're both owned by Media House, big digital focus. So can you tell us a little bit about what you see in how stories get interest from different audiences in the different publications?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things that you can actually, when you're publishing digitally now, you can actually see in real time what stories are performing and what stories don't perform. And there can be, there can be many different reasons why it can be, if you take out like time of publication, etc., and you can publish something when it's a really, really busy news agenda and it gets lost, and then you put it up on a Wednesday evening when there's nothing else happening, or a Tuesday evening or something, and it'll get an audience. But I did compile a bit of a list basically
Great.
on stories which, have performed, because we would share a copy with the Irish Independent. So people who have Belfast Telegraph or the Irish Independent subscriptions would see copy from both across titles and Sunday World within that. So we examined data from the last 18 months. So I'm not going to go through it and go through figures of it. And I mean, I suppose we're talking about the time that people are spending on it. So the subscriber attention minutes, and say from the Indo story that was published on the Independent and then was taken by the Belfast Telegraph, it's pretty obvious, anything to do with Northern Ireland figures, big figures, be they Rory McIlroy, Jerry Adams, Conor Murphy moving down, taking is Rowan DeShannon, Ian Paisley Jr., anything like that. There was, there's Owen Harris had a big interview in the Sunday Independent, which obviously I think it was in Alan English's last edition as editor, which did particularly well and was particularly long, so that helps subscriber attention time. But then there's other ones which probably less obvious, would be the daughter of Jason Corbett, Sarah Corbett Lynch. Another one, that Conor McGregor, transcends borders. You can insert your own joke here. Then other more human interest ones, like the 9 home renovations I tell people not to waste money on. Inside the Secret Life of a Cabin Crew. And an investment portfolio of 600 grand in 7 years. And a Ryanair passenger tells of his flight from hell. So it's, obviously it's going to be dominated by the local interest, but it's not exclusive to that. Stories do transcend borders. You'll see people are used to reading copy from wherever they get their platform. They're I suppose they're brand neutral. They'll read wherever they want. And then there's the ones that worked the other way, coming from Belfast to Dublin. There's, again, it's the same, Jeffrey Donaldson, obviously, streets ahead. Anything on Mountbatten, Kincora. Then there's a story about, I just dumped my electric car and I couldn't be happier, which is one of the top ones. But it's that universality. So, well, there are particular, there are things which people will, certainly in my experience in the South, the turn off. Like, there's a reason, people who had access to BBC, UTV or whatever, that was access to Britain, British culture. It wasn't access to Northern Ireland. I don't know how many people used to watch Jerry Kelly or how many people watched the Hole in the Wall gang, in the Republic. I'm sure there's some, but, they'd rather watch Graham Norton on BBC rather than the Jerry Kelly show years previously, so.
I should say I was one of those people who grew up in a single channel household. My parents would never hear of getting a high aerial, as it was called then. So I didn't see Coronation Street till I was 18 or something.
The second partition of Ireland.
Exactly. So it is funny how those shared cultural stories are quite interesting. So sport, crime, and then the lifestyle ones.
The lifestyle, but the crime ones, and then like human tragedy. Like, for instance, there was a horrendous crash in Armagh. There's obviously on the roads. I think towards the end of last March, which which translated and which did particularly, is a tragic story, but was particularly well read. The Derry Lynn tragedy, we had a big feature on that. The 4 members of the Gossip family.
So they're human stories.
Human interest, which will, but people, like, you look at one of the biggest stories internationally last week was an Australian story. It was the mushroom murders or whatever. So I mean, and that's what, for instance, the Jeffrey Donaldson trial. Or the charges against him and his arrest.
Yeah.
I mean, that was obviously going to do well no matter where it was.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that's interesting. It's what we share in common as humans. Sarah, now you're pitching to different media organizations, or you'll be called by different organizations for comment on certain things. So what do you notice about what is different in terms of how you need to pitch, or in terms of how you are framed?
In terms of pitching, so when you pitch locally, so I've pitched Eoin once, just email him and go, do you fancy this hot take? And he'll go, oh, okay. Definitely when you're pitching to a Northern Ireland publication, they get the nuances, they get what you're talking about. And that seems obvious, but what I mean by that is sometimes when I pitch to publications outside Northern Ireland, even in Britain and the South, sometimes they'll say, look, I know what you mean, but you need to explain like we're five, okay?
Yeah.
You need to, your article needs to be drafted in a certain way that is clear. So, for instance, I recently, a couple of weeks ago, I wrote an article for The Guardian about the pogroms in Ballymena. And I started the article with, it was about a really horrendous murder during the Troubles. And they came back to me and said, we're not entirely sure an international audience will get the link about why you're mentioning this. And I mean, I thought it was obvious, but they often have to, so I mean, we reworded it, we worked it, I wanted that in. I was like, that is the point of the article, quite frankly. But so they kept it. But very often when you do media overseas, like the BBC, when you do a hit or when you do a piece, very often they will say, explain like I'm five, Sarah, just keep it basic. Don't go into the nuances of it. They're not going to get it. So that is something you do have to navigate, and sometimes people will say, you know, we don't know about that, the viewers won't get this.
And do you find that the interest internationally is still on, we'll call northern stories, or conflict-related stories like Ballymena or something like that? Like, is it harder to get an interest in, say, something about, you know, maybe economics or other wider cultural aspects that you would share with the rest of the island or with Britain?
Oh, 100%, yeah. So, you know, I remember when... you know, when the DUP got into their confidence and supply agreement with the Tory government, all of a sudden everybody discovered all these people were posting these articles, you know, oh my goodness, the DUP are religious fundamentalists. We had no idea. And, you know, they're anti-abortion. And, you know, Northern Ireland had had the strictest abortion laws in the United Kingdom for, 50 years or something like that. And, you know, I remember feminist activists in Northern Ireland saying, you know, we were trying to get them to cover these stories for decades and they would not listen to us. Some of these left-wing publications in England would not let us talk about this issue. But now the DUP are in bed with the Tories. Oh, yes. And then, you know, the other thing then about conflict is often it is such a difficult subject and it's often not treated with the nuance it deserved. So, you know, I was asked... It was a television program, a southern television program. Somebody had pulled out, a unionist had clearly pulled out of a feature, and they rang me with half an hour to go before air to talk for 10 minutes about the fact that Sinn Féin it was to do with a murder, an IRA murder during the Troubles, and they wanted me to talk about this, and I said no because I thought this is a very delicate situation. And they clearly just wanted a unionist, and I don't know what perspective they were hoping for. You've got the IRA man in Preston, he has a family that are still alive, and then there's his victim. And quite frankly, being asked to do a 10-minute piece on it, where I think the unionist that pulled out was obviously not going to be nice about the IRA, by the way, which, I mean, I don't like them either. But I didn't appreciate that. I did not appreciate that kind of characterization of, oh, well, you're a unionist, you're a Protestant, so on you go.
Yeah.
You know, for an incredibly
so they
difficult
can't
subject.
see past the political element.
It's you know, they wanted a unionist, somebody to be, oh, the IRA and Sinn Féin. You know, it just, for me personally, I did not like that. I did not appreciate that.
Eamonn, so what about yourself? So you've worked for both domestic and international publications. So compare and contrast what that experience is like.
Coverage to the north for the, and I think Amanda would back this up, for the likes of Reuters. Myself was New York Times. It's very carefully done. Basically, the mechanics of it would be for stormed elections. Would it be the Paisley-Adams deal? and there'd be a lot of vox popping going on. Basically, you get down to your tea, you do vox pops. For the American audience, predominantly, you'd go up the Anderson Road, opposite Curly, what's now Asda, I knew it as Curly's. You'd do a vox pop there. You'd leave your Southern registration car on the Falls Road. You'd walk up to the Shankill to do the outside a pub in the Shankill vox pop. And then you'd go to Marks and Spencer's on the Lisburn Road for supposedly the Alliance middle class viewpoint.
So everyone is in their little
you got down
pigeonholes.
To your tea, there was a ballot. They tend to work actually bizarrely. There was when, as the New York Times had it, when Dr. No said yes, you did a stuff in Ballymena. You find yourself racing up after being back in Dublin. The international media, quite rightly, because it's a small island, they see it quite rightly as the same story, north and south. They're well capable of looking at other conflict areas and seeing a wider area. And bring it back to Dublin newsrooms, I'm quite critical, as you know.
Tell us about that,
Now, there's a totally different, 25 years ago, Tony O'Reilly bought the Telegraph. He overpaid for it. He basically, from Trinity Mirror, Dennis O'Brien, he controlled INM, but he owned INM, and Media House. And that gap has been, and we can argue this because we've got more experts in it, that gap has been retained, basically the separate. There was an opportunity there 25 years ago to build an all-Ireland media outlet.
Okay.
Right? And the commercial imperative was there. 25 years ago, you had also the Irish Times had a dedicated business reporter, correspondent covering Belfast. That's gone. You had, 25 years ago, you had commonly RT staff, I don't mean the two people in Belfast, doing packages, be it cultural packages, being whatever. 25 years ago, up and down to Belfast in the day. You don't get that anymore.
And what do you think's driving that? Is that economics, that they say they just can't afford it? Or do you think they're making a call that people aren't that interested in it, so it's not worth it? Or do you think it's just prejudice?
I think it's bizarre, to be honest.
Okay.
Given that
you've
got, the way I put it is that the UTV was obviously set up 1959 with basically an Ulster Unionist, won the contract. Basically, the weather maps, when I was being brought up, was the 6 counties.
Yeah.
6 counties with the famous weather map, which also appeared on the Ulster Unionist badges. That was not lost on anybody. BBC NI did the weather. The weather stopped at Londonderry.
Weather warnings still do stop.
The weather warnings still do stop, including Met Éireann.
Yeah.
Then you flip that 25 years later, and you're more likely to get the sea lapping County Monaghan out of RTE, out of the famous Late Late Show, quite insulting to Irish citizens, north and south.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, it's the famous Ryan Tubridy's 26 county map of Ireland.
Oh, yes,
with
yes.
The sea
That's
lapping.
right, the 6 counties were cut off.
Then you look at the whole idea of a media out of Dublin. I think that's basically one newspaper which has got 2 staff that's the Irish Times, and you've got RTE, which you do not hear any northern voices on. In any context, you can go 7 days a week without hearing any, especially the weekends, which is cultural stuff. You get to an extent that. Then you look at the op-ed pages, and I'm on a roll here. So.
Amanda, hang in there.
Then you look at the op-ed. You look at the op-ed pages of a newspaper which sees itself as a pluralistic newspaper of ideas. The Irish Times. The op-ed page is basically a combination of Northern Unionism or Southern Unionism. There is no Northern, bizarrely, given the rapid change in demographics, given the 2 million. And in terms of, I'll just finally, because my specialism was also economics and business, you compare and contrast. I'll leave this to later, the other observation to later. But what is quite bizarre, and I wouldn't think, you've got 2 million and growing population, 5 million in the south, and you wouldn't think it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
We're in a shrinking industry which needs every advertising, euro, sterling that they can collect.
Why are they ignoring the market?
And it is, anyway, I'll leave that dangling.
Well, as they say, there's a lot to unpack there, and we will get to all of that, and I want to hear Owen's perspective on that too. So Amanda, so tell us about your experiences then, and maybe reacting a little bit to what you've heard already.
Partition is intentionally divisive and designed so that people didn't know each other. So I don't beat up on people whenever there's a level of ignorance, and it can work both ways as well. You know, in my experience working for outlets across Ireland and across Britain, that can happen in both directions. You know, I often sometimes feel that I would make a good primary school teacher because I approach people who have different levels of understanding, different levels of wanting to understand. So it's my job to explain a complicated part of the world to other jurisdictions or to the rest of the world. International audiences are interested in what happens in the north. There can be a tendency sometimes whenever there's any sort of violence in the north for people to, you know, producers are suddenly ringing me, you know, asking questions like, are we going to return to the Troubles? And I'm like, no, we are not. You know, there was an example a few years ago where there was some street disorder and there was one bus that was set on fire, and that turned into, you know, loyalists are revolting over Brexit. And I was like, listen, there's a dozen different reasons why that happened, and I'm going to explain all of them to you. So just don't jump on the simplistic sort of easy interpretation. And also, sometimes the North can be judged more harshly than other jurisdictions because of our past, because we know with the Dublin riots, with rioting that happened in Wales and in London, this is something that all jurisdictions are dealing with. It's not just specific to Northern Ireland. And I have, you know, I think everybody is a product of their environment and their age and their upbringing and so on. So whenever someone's talking, I always like to know what age they are whenever they're talking, what their experience is, where they've worked, where they've grown up, because that informs their experience and how they feel about it. I actually, I'm not as pessimistic as some other people, because I think Irish media in both jurisdictions is really high quality in comparison to some jurisdictions. Obviously, when you work in Northern Ireland, you have to keep an eye on what's happening in Belfast and Dublin and London, and internationally, the Americans love us and Europe as well. So that's all in the mix. And I think that there is a lot of great all-island work already happening. I started my career at the Belfast Telegraph in 2010. My work appears in the Indo. I was contacted by the Sunday Times to do work for them. I did the Irish Times role for a number of years as well. And I do appear on broadcast media in this jurisdiction. It will be for Northern Stories. Occasionally I'll do a Donegal story because they sort of think, well, it's close enough, you know, so that's fine. And the same happens in Britain. Sometimes in terms of international significance, you know, for the news wires and the news agencies, it has to be high bar. It has to be of international significance or involve government players. They're not going to cover every twist and turn that local places have. And of course, all of the local outlets are most interested in the local stories. But I think what we're seeing over the years is that newsrooms and outlets are developing more of an all-island presence. We know that happens with Media House, that it happens with the Irish Times. The appointment of Mark Hennessy, who used to be my news editor, as the Britain and Ireland editor, shows that there's a refocusing in on the relationship between the two islands. And obviously Brexit Brexit has had a role to play in the resetting of those relationships in recent times. But I did a little test because I didn't want to rush down here from Belfast this morning, so I arrived in Dublin yesterday, and I took myself to the spa and had an absolutely marvellous spa day. And I tuned into the news last night and also into the radio stations this morning to see what stories they were covering. So last night I watched Virgin News at 7. There was obviously stories about terrible murder and petrol bombs and so on happening in West Dublin. But then there was President Macron visiting the UK, visiting Keir Starmer. There was the report on Norman Tebbit dying from the Conservative Party and him talking about the 2021 census in the north, showing that unity was more likely in the future, and then all the references made to the Brighton bomb and the injuries his wife suffered and so on. And then there was also what Eoin was talking about with regard to sport. It was a big fuss made of Shelbourne and Linfield playing. That's League of Ireland and the Northern Ireland Football League. Then this morning there was a press release in my email inbox from the Fianna Fáil press office, because I make sure that I get all of the stuff from Britain and from the rest of Ireland and the local stuff as well. And it was Micheál Martin had attended the launch of a book called The Root of All Evil, the Irish Boundary Commission, and that's by the Dublin-based historian Cormac Moore, who nobody could replace Eamonn Phoenix at the Irish News, the late great Eamonn Phoenix, but Cormac Moore was employed by the Irish News, which was a great move on their part to take over that kind of history column that appears in the Irish News. And I was at the Belfast launch. Obviously, Micheál Martin was at the Dublin launch, and it was a really interesting quote from him. Partition broke apart a single, more diverse society and created states which were less diverse and more open to being dominated by one interest, and by creating jurisdictions which were likely to diverge significantly, partition was designed to be intractable. So that's the Taoiseach of this jurisdiction talking about that. Obviously, recent Irish governments have made a lot of the Shared Island initiative, which is a more, it's not sort of specifically aimed around unity, but it's more of a gentle all-island project.
So what does that list of stories tell you? What do you read from that?
Well, whenever I tuned into Morning Ireland this morning, Audrey Carville was one of the co-presenters. Audrey obviously does a programme on Radio Ulster, Sunday Sequence, but they read out the Belfast Telegraph headline about the Loyalist bonfire and one of the issues that there are around health and safety concerns. And then a lot of the issues that come up are both sides of the border. So one of the big stories over the last day is about the opt-out organ donation.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, you see repeatedly, whether it's repeal or LGBT equality, all these issues take place. And it's almost like a replica of the same story, but because it's happening at different paces, then it's covered twice. But I definitely think that there is good work already happening, and I know because I work for such a variety of people that they are aware that the demographics of this part of the world are changing, that there could be constitutional change in the future, and people are readying their teams and making appointments on that basis.
So you think the coverage is fair enough, it's balanced, or it could do better, but you see it's on a momentum?
There's probably people in the Republic of Ireland who complain that the news focuses too Dublin-centric, that there isn't enough coverage of other parts of the rest of the island. So you only have to look to the example of German reunification. Obviously, their media outlets and the landscape there was a lot different when you were dealing with East and West Germany. And what they have found is that there has been an integration of media. If constitutional change happens here, whenever they flick a switch, people will just spring into action, because that's what journalists do. We go to other parts of the world. Like I was out in Lebanon a few years ago. I was more than able to, and in fact, they actually were delighted whenever they found out I was from Belfast, because they were like, "Oh, you'll understand sectarianism." I was like, "Of course I will." So, I think that those things are actually already happening. And while there are sort of negative attitudes and people who are sort of rude about either jurisdiction or have a lack of understanding about either jurisdiction, I think sometimes that can be focused on too much, and there can be too much of a play made on binary radio arguments about issues. Yes, there are some people who don't know what's happening in the other jurisdiction, but there are plenty of people that do. And if there is a constitutional change, I don't think it'll take people long to adapt. And of course, there will be a hangover media where you're not going to automatically get rid of particular types of localized media. And I'm sure even within Germany, there are grievances that exist to this day about coverage. average, but you know.
Yeah. So, Sarah, as a user then, as a consumer of media, so for example, my mother-in-law who lives in Glengormley loves RTE, likes
Yeah.
Nationwide, stuff like that. To what extent is there still a sense, though, of the other? And I confess, I would be completely guilty of this. If I'm on the Irish Independent website and I'll see some headline, maybe it's a court report or something, I might click on it, realise it's from the north, and I might go, oh, and I can consciously feel my interest dropping, which I know might upset, especially Eamon, people like that. But I
certainly.
wonder, yeah,
Should
but I
do.
wonder if I'm experiencing that. Are other people experiencing that? That's why I mention it. So, you know, what's your read as a consumer of media?
Well, yeah,
and
I
the
mean-
sense of otherness.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, for sure. I mean, we all relate to stories that link to where we live. So, you know, if you live in Cork, you're going to want to know what's going on in Cork. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, Northern Ireland is I mean, it's on the same island, but it's up the road. England is just across the water. Likewise, people in England, when they're looking at stories from Northern Ireland, often go, you know, that's over there. I think that's normal. I think that's fine. I suppose.
Now, you see, Eamon, I'm not that bad.
I think that's fine, but I suppose, but the sense of the other, absolutely. So, you know, I didn't have RTE growing up. We didn't get that signal. So I didn't know what the Late Toy Show was. I had no idea about any of these things. You know, we didn't listen. I listened to the BBC. I grew up watching the BBC. You know, I'm British and I'm Irish, but my Britishness was more informed by the TV shows and the media I consumed growing up, really. You know, Newton Emerson wrote a really good article about it many years ago. A lot of people in Northern Ireland are the same. That's why we feel British. It's not because of, you know, the 12th of July. It's we grew up watching, you know, BBC. But Unionists would tend to see the Republic as another
Another
a
country.
foreign country.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up thinking of the Republic of Ireland as being another country,
Yeah.
not my country. It was a country I had no issue with, but a different country. Whereas somebody from a nationalist Republican background would see it as being their part of their country. So, you know, I definitely did not take as much of an interest in Irish politics growing up. You know, I would have talked about
And
Blair
what
and
about
Brown
RTE
and-
now? Is RTE viewed widely, would you say, or would it still be more viewed by Catholics and nationalists?
I think it would, but you know, I mean, I think even Emma Pengelly said she loved watching
Yeah,
the
she
Toy
watched the
Show.
Late Late
She
Show.
watched the
Right.
Late Late Show growing up, you know, in the DP, and lots of people around the border would have watched
Yeah.
RTE and would frequently listen to RTE radio. So, you know, I don't. For my generation, I'm 38 next month. I mean, I don't really distinguish between the two in my head.
Okay, so that's
you know?
interesting. Now, Owen, so Eamon was talking about 25 years ago, Tony O'Reilly bought the Belfast Telegraph, already owned the Indo. Dennis O'Brien is sitting there, owned both outlets. I know all across the media we have shared news desks. So was it discussed as a strategy that there would be a single
Well, I wasn't there at
outlet?
the time, so I was working. I
Right,
was working
yeah.
as a sub editor on
Yeah,
the sports desk in
yeah.
the Star.
But since
I
then-
think nothing shows the difference in how things have changed. Than ask how much Tony O'Reilly paid for the Belfast Telegraph back in the early 2000s, and it was £300 million sterling. When you think Media House bought I&M less than 20 years later for 125 million sterling when you translated it, and that was all of I&M. That was all, you know, the Independent, everything. So if you want, you know, I would imagine, I wasn't there, so I can't speak for those people who were in the room, but they didn't spend £300 million on, you know, yes, there was good politics behind it in terms of it was post-Good Friday Agreement. I think that might have been an element to it. It was it was seen as statesman-like, and kind of Tony O'Reilly, the rugby hero or whatever, and kind of, you know, he was doing this deed to kind of unify the people, or you know, but it was business. You know, it made 20 million a year.
So there was no question of unifying the papers.
I can't imagine there was. Now, if
Yeah.
Media House, if the same deal was done now,
Yeah.
and Media House were there, you know, I mean, they would be looking at creating a single entity. Like, we're already sharing media. If it made sense for us to call ourselves the Irish Independent, we would call ourselves the Irish Independent tomorrow, I'd say. But it doesn't make sense.
And why
you know,
doesn't it make sense?
It doesn't, because the Belfast Telegraph
Yeah.
is 155 years old in September.
Right.
It has a heritage. It is a, you know, for better or worse, it's older than Northern Ireland. it was founded in Ireland. It was founded for its people who were, and we might choose to ignore it, who were a different community. And Belfast grew so much in the 19th century that it became, I think at one stage it actually outgrew Dublin and had a bigger population than Dublin.
Yeah.
And that was all leveraged on its links to Britain.
So, Eamonn,
Shipbuilding,
is that not the fundamental
cetera,
point, that irrespective of one's personal political outlook or desire, and Mary Daly often talks about this, partition has been a reality for 100 years. It's been a much harder partition than East and West Germany. They are different jurisdictions. They are different communities. It is the other side of the mountain. There is a sense of othering, and maybe the commercial realities mean that the audiences aren't sufficiently interested in what's going on in the other place.
I think it's the opposite. The change has been so dramatic in terms of economics, in terms of the wealth in the Republic, and we're talking about a disconnect between basically of what my experience of Dublin newsrooms and their ignorance of the North.
And do you think that's a willful ignorance?
It's practically institutionalized.
Okay.
And it's not reflected in my mother's side, my late mother's side of the family is from Leitrim. It's not reflected in their knowledge of the North. In other words, I think there's a disconnect between the stories being produced by Dublin newsrooms. As I said, it's not pluralistic. It's a very, very narrow base, which covers the newspapers, covers the North. Basically, the Irish Independent doesn't cover the North.
And what drives
don't have
that?
Staff up there.
What do you think is behind that?
Well, I'll leave that question hanging.
Go on.
There's a huge disconnect.
All right.
Well, sorry, the Irish. I mean,
I say that
I mean, obviously, I mean, the media house who runs the Irish Independent and also the local newspapers, the regional newspaper, also runs Belfast Telegraph. It employs 350 people on the island, and which I think makes us the largest all-island organisation. Obviously, BBC Northern Ireland is the greatest tank on our lawn that we're ever going to have.
But what about, say, cross-employment?
Cross-employment, there's a lot. I mean, there's the departments which are done on all-island basis, sales, circulation, all the back office stuff, editorial. To serve Northern Ireland, we need our own independent newsroom. I'm not in conferences with the Irish Independent every day or the Sunday World. Yes, we talk about issues of common, but I mean, I edit independently for better or worse.
But say about, so you're Southern and you're the editor. Are there many Northern staff in the Indo and vice versa?
I couldn't. I've never worked in the Indo's newsroom, so I don't know. There would be the deputy or the director of publishing operations is from Ed McCann. He's from Belfast.
So Amanda, I'm just interested now in, do you think that there is insufficient interest by audiences north and south in each other, or do you think that media is cutting audiences north and south off from each other by poor editorial decision making, and that there would be more interest if they drove it? So should the editorial decisions be reflective of their audience, or should they be a means to change the interests of their audience?
I think you need to be careful whenever you're sort of generalising that all people in Dublin have a particular attitude towards the North, or all citizens have a particular attitude or interest in what's happening. Of course, there are people who are keenly engaged in everything that's happened across the island. The media setup and the newsrooms that we have now reflect the jurisdictional reality of this part of the world that we're in. But it may, if Eoin decides to stay in the Belfast Telegraph for a long part of his career, he may well find himself in an editorial meeting with the Indo, post unity, if that's something that happens in the time ahead. That's what I was trying to say earlier about not being too harsh on people. people. You know, Simon Harris, I think it was last year, was criticised for making comments about how, you know, people in Dublin may know Berlin better than they know Belfast.
Yeah.
But, you know, someone in Derry probably knows Donegal better than he might.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's, people are a product of their own experience. You are, Sarah is, Owen is, you know, we all are. And I don't think that there's that much of anything to sort of worry too much about, because as we've heard throughout the conversation, whenever it makes business sense for the flick of the switch, it'll happen. You know, like if it becomes a new dispensation, then the media will adapt to that. Yes, there could probably be a little less partitionist attitudes in some of the newsroom, but a lot of the news is regional. This is a very small island, so you know it's not unexpected.
So Sarah, what's
Belfast
your
has a big
reaction to
paper.
that, and the level of interest in the you know, from a commercial sense?
I mean, we're all nosy, right? So, you know, the stories that cross borders. I mean, the big story that everyone I know was talking about, along with the mushroom killer, which I don't know how that missed me, but apparently this is a big thing.
Yeah.
Was, you know, that revelation about that book, The Salt Path, and
Yes.
we all love a wee takedown, you know, of somebody who's been self-righteous. You know, people will link into stories like when the Iris Robinson gate broke. Everybody loved that. That
It's
was
on
a
my
huge,
list.
huge scandal. You know, RHI, I think cross borders.
Yeah.
If it's
Royal
intrigue,
stories,
sex, all those things, people, it sells, right? I suppose in this day and age, because we're probably going to come on to talk about new media, but these guys are
Yeah.
competing against TikTok. They're competing against all these different media platforms. They're competing against citizens journalists. Now, I don't want to diminish them, because I mean, I got into this because somebody saw my tweets, right? Some people would be fantastic journalists and do a great job at bringing awareness to different audiences, but we're in an attention economy.
Yes.
You know, so it's people are scrolling on their phones, and that algorithm's making them click. You have to get something to grab their attention.
Oh, and now I know Media House is very commercial, and they are counting all the clicks, and they can tell how long someone is reading my column for, and if they don't get past the first paragraph 10 weeks in a row, I guess I get the chop. So so you know what people are doing, yeah?
I know what they're saying about your column as well. No, I really don't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, but I guess Eamonn's thesis is that we could be doing better.
Oh, no, I think, and I mean,
Dublin newsrooms.
Dublin
Dublin
newsrooms.
newsrooms.
Yeah.
I think it's been transformed out of Belfast. Their
Okay.
understanding of the South is
Yeah.
much superior now. I think we're being let down by the Dublin newsrooms.
Oh, but I think
That's my
Right. So
guess.
you're not in a Dublin newsroom, to be fair.
No,
but is there-
no.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think. I mean,
yeah.
I would broaden it out. I mean, like, I mean, there's two big players who I think we would probably think could do better. I mean, which are the two state broadcasters,
Yeah.
which are our public service, RTE and the BBC, and I think they're the ones that we pay a license fee.
Yes.
I may pay 2 license fees. Actually, the first person to knock on my door when in the house I rented first in South Belfast was a license inspector. So the first
No
person I answered
way.
the door to was where's your so.
And did you have
basically-
a license?
I'd only moved in. I didn't even have a telly.
They hear that all the
But,
time.
yeah,
Yeah.
Well, it was true. It was true.
Anyway, go on.
But I think they can do better. And I think in a way it's easier for the BBC because, well, they've got...
They're richer.
They're richer, a bigger organisation there, the BBC. But they also have the permission to cover the Republic in a way that maybe RTE doesn't feel that, or feels it doesn't, because obviously 40% of the population identify as Irish. So last weekend you had the BBC televising 2 hurling All-Ireland finals on BBC Northern Ireland, and the sign of how things have changed is that the BBC aren't covering the 12th live, which
Right.
was a decision, controversial decision, which they took a few years back. But that they covered, but also there was no Ulster interest within those games. I think
Okay.
RTE, on the other hand, I think I mentioned it. When it comes to sport, they leave a lot to be desired. I think obviously I think Amanda mentioned the Linfield Shelbourne match on tonight, which is actually being covered on RTE, but that's because Shelbourne are playing. I think Larne got to group stage this last year of a European competition, and I remember every Friday morning I used to listen to the sports news to see if RTE mentioned it, and they never mentioned them once, when they got to group stage. Until they got to group stage. Also, the Olympics was a real case in point, where it's basically Team Ireland's gold medals counted in Northern Ireland, but for Team GB athletes who won gold medals, you would barely know they existed.
Right.
If you were to follow RTE coverage.
I want to do a quick hit with Amanda and Sarah on new media, and then I'll go to you for questions. Amanda, so I think you're big on Insta. Is that, did you tell me that, Sarah?
TikTok.
TikTok. You're on TikTok.
Amanda did this thing. You published your first TikTok, and I think it went viral. It was about a gorilla.
Oh yeah, it was
Just
ridiculous.
without even trying.
It's kind of a bit of a mean place. My biggest following's probably on Twitter. For better or worse, I'm staying on Twitter. I'm refusing to call it X.
Quite right.
I was there before Elon Musk was, so I'm not moving.
Yeah.
I think that, as a freelance journalist and, someone that communicates with their audience either through the TV or radio or writing or social media, my social media is just as important to me as my main clients that provide most of my income. I think sometimes younger journalists fall into the trap of thinking that all news exists online, and perhaps for resourcing issues, sometimes they can't get out to actually meet the public as much as they could do, and we have to caution on that in journalism to make sure that people are actually still getting out and about within the communities. I think the rise in podcasts and independent media is something that's going to be a theme going into the future, and it's what all of the sort of traditional outlets are having to compete with at the moment, and you can see the divergence in how they're trying to reach listeners and reach readers.
And sorry, but do you notice, say, with TikTok, so you had this funny gorilla video that might have got you new followers who weren't there because you're the Northern Ireland correspondent of whatever, but they're interested in you and your world outlook. So is that kind of a new kind of shared media, that they're not viewing you solely through a prism of Northern Ireland politics?
Yeah, my motivation for going on to TikTok was because my nephews were there and because my friends' kids were there, and they were absolutely furious whenever the first TikTok I put up went viral. I don't really actually use it that much. I think it is important, and it's an important tool for communicating with people, but I don't think it's, people want to feel as if they can trust me and that they know me as an individual journalist, and that is where social media is really important. And also, because I work for myself and I'm self-employed, and apparently that makes me the backbone of the economy, whether you're in Ireland or in Britain, whenever you're showing what you're doing, if I show a piece that I've written, then other outlets will contact me to talk about it.
Right.
So it benefits me in that sense, and also it's a bit of crack. And there are people online who are horrendous trolls,
but
they
some are so funny.
They're always in the minority of people. Most people are engaging in good faith and are decent and are sound and are complimentary and all the rest of it. So I think that it's important, but you have to have a balance.
Any questions? I'm sure there was. Anyone like to chip in? Is that not natural, though? In human terms, that because partition has gone on so long, and by simple geography, and different culture and things like that. So it can be political, and intentionally political, Eamonn might argue. But is it also...
I think we're way past.
Right.
My thing is driven by impatience. I was trying to detail what happened 25 years ago, and it has got worse. Thank you, David, for RTE backing up, which I know quite a bit about as well. Thanks.
Okay. Owen, you want to get in on that?
I suppose a little personal perspective in terms of, I get asked a lot, how, so how do you get on up there? And the Belfast Telegraph, obviously traditional, well, what I like to describe as establishment paper, establishment unionist, rather than, it always prided itself that it was read across both sides of the community. That was probably because you had to buy it if you wanted a job, if you wanted to buy a car, if you wanted to sell a car, as well, as much as anything else, as much to do. It was certainly more moderate. How do you get on? I mean, they're not really, I said, no, they get on fine, but it's the reaction down here is that how do you stick that lot? How do you put up with them? I know, I just, people who, is it not, there is that view. The newsroom in RTE or in other newsrooms, unfortunately, it's largely reflective of a lot of people on the street.
Is that a product
And
of
it's-
the
it's
conflict?
ignorant.
I disagree. I do think
All right.
my experience is that Dublin newsrooms are not reflective of opinion in the Republic.
Okay.
You can see it in opinion polls. You can see it in opinion polls relating to the referendum of the border poll. You can see it in, there is an agenda definitely going through editorial output, and the fact that the ignorance is sublime at a time when the only opportunity down the line is all Ireland political coverage, all Ireland economic coverage. You cannot cover Trump tariffs apart from looking at an all-Ireland basis. There's one company on this island which is going to be most affected by the Trump tariffs, already been affected by Trump tariffs, and that's in East Belfast. It's Spirit Aerosystems, 3,700 jobs there, and you would go a long way to reading a Dublin newspaper that this is the #1 target of Trump tariffs because of aluminium, because of what goes into building airplanes.
Yeah.
And it is quite frustrating. Also, the coverage of the cost of reunification debate. You get last week, as recent as last week, you get Professor John Doyle. And he's questioning the.
But sorry, can I just come back to that one about the jobs? You know, I'd be saying, well, we're the Republic of Ireland. We've got all this corporation tax coming in.
We're in Europe.
Yeah, you're in Europe. So if there are jobs being lost in Northern Ireland, that does not affect our bottom line.
Can I just say,
Amanda,
I cover
yeah.
that story for Reuters.
Right.
You know, that's an international story. It's a business story,
Yes.
so that does get covered.
Yeah.
I think we're falling into the trap again here of thinking that certain sections of newsroom are representative of everybody across the island. I can only go on my experience of working for Dublin teams being based in Belfast. So my experience is different, you know, from if you're working in Dublin. And I don't come across that attitude. I know that attitude exists among some people, but the same level of sort of ignorance or understanding applies whenever I'm dealing with Dublin newsrooms as it applies whenever I'm dealing with British newsrooms as well. So it just depends who you're dealing with.
Sarah.
Yeah,
And so, by the way, I know we've done an hour already. The time has flown, and I don't want to keep people too much longer.
No, I was going to say, no, I agree with Amanda. I think there's
Yeah.
ignorance in Britain and in the South. I think I don't expect people to know every nuance about Northern Irish society. I mean, I don't know. There's intricacies in politics in the South that I don't have a clue about.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But I think in Northern Ireland, and I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I think it's because so many significant things happened that also affected the Republic, that if that's not taken into consideration, it makes people angry, it makes people kind of annoyed that they have to sort of explain themselves.
And just on that,
Now-
so do you feel you need to have a clue and need to know more about Dublin? Because on a day-to-day basis, does a decision in Dublin actually affect your life? Or maybe your peers might not think
yes
that.
and no.
Yeah.
It doesn't. No, absolutely no. It depends what media you read. You know, if you read some of the Unionist newspapers, you know, Dublin's the interloper, and look what Leo Varadkar has done now. You know, when off he pops.
He's very talkative.
Jim Alister's raging against him, and other ones. It's like, oh yeah, Leo's great. He's chill. Look what he's
Sammy
doing.
Wilson.
Isn't it fantastic? I was going to say, well, the point I was actually going to make, which I haven't talked too much about, is obviously Northern Protestants and Unionists, we are kind of, it's the same in Britain and down south. People are like, you know, often I'm asked to go on to do media, and it's very much, why are the Protestants like this, Sarah?
Yes.
Please explain to us, why are your people like this? And you have to kind of go, well, and so you guys would maybe say the bonfires in the Irish language, and there actually is a lot of diverse opinion within unionism and Protestantism, and sometimes, you know, I have found Southern media to be very receptive sometimes to different views and say, you know, actually, you've come from a different angle. Do you know anybody else? People like Julianne Corr-Johnson, who's a socialist loyalist, you know, all these different perspectives. But equally, you have to deal with the unionists you have, and unfortunately, there are some views that even I don't agree with. So unionism, often you sometimes in the South, is people are very, very curious, and then you get, you know, those types of stories coming and people go, oh my God. You know, I did an event in DCU a couple of years ago, and one of the academics there told me she'd had Danielle Roberts' talk, and Danielle's a feminist activist. She's pro-choice activist. She's a socialist, and she said her students could not believe that she was a unionist and a Protestant.
Because she was so normal.
Because they said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yeah." She said she's a feminist. She's a socialist.
Oh,
and
Owen wants a brief word.
Yeah,
Be brief.
but I think I think
Yeah.
I think there is a tendency to kind of take unionists and people who identify as British in Northern Ireland for granted. It is a real identity. They feel a bond to Britain. They gravitate towards London. They talk about national media. They mean London. They don't mean Dublin. They don't mean
And
the
of course
independent.
they would.
And of course,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
is. It's not something you can be wished away or pretend doesn't exist or you can ignore, ever. It is an actual identity. They feel for the royal family the way I feel for the Dub footballers, you know, and you can't.
Not all of them. Not all of them. But some, but I know what you mean.
But I mean, like it's and
Can I just say, in a new Ireland, though, it's not going to be just one group of people's views who matter. There's different ways to be a Republican, different ways to be a unionist, a spread of views across the spectrum, and that is something, in my view, which will give people the opportunity to create something new.
I'm going to leave it there. Lunch is going to be served and we can all continue the conversation. My final word would be, having worked in media for nearly 20 years, it doesn't matter what the subject is. Media loves the binary. They love polarization. If I'm asked on to a debate to express opinion A, they're setting up someone who has opinion B, and they're not really interested in shared ideas. That's my experience of it. So I will leave that there. Thanks, my guest.